Caddis Maximus here, this time with a quick review of specialty hammers, unique hammers, and general striking tools. I'm just going to make this a pretty quick review, just as another entry to my Caddis Maximus YouTube tool database. Or maybe I should say a tool knowledge base. And I felt I had enough of these where I can make a quick video. I've done a video about these before. This was part of a Harbor Freight body and fender set, and they come with some pretty unique hammers. They're specially shaped. They tend to have very square edges, and they use a set of anvils so that you can literally hit and bend and shape sheet metal. These could also be used with ball peen hammers, which are the same type of situation. These are just a little bit more specialized, so you can try to match specialty shapes, lines, and creases that would be found in automotive body panels. But of course, they're great for shaping any form of sheet metal. These are just Harbor Freight ones, and most of them they tend to have either round or square heads. And so the other side would be something unique, such as this side has a blade. This one right here has a real sharp spike just to try to make real tight contours. You could use this as peening, but it's just a real sharp point, which can be handy sometimes. And then a general use one, which has both a round and a square head. One thing to mention on these is that the round heads tend to be flat, and then the square sides tend to just have a slight curve to them. And these body and fender hammers do show up, not just the Harbor Freight ones, but any brands do occasionally show up in used bins and flea markets, and so now you can kind of have an idea of exactly what those are about. We'll get to these in a minute. We have some more specialty things. We have a Najda, this is actually a real tool. This is not homemade. This is what's known as a tire checker. So I didn't really know what review I'd put these in, so I put it in specialty hammers. This really isn't a hammer, although I do have used it to knock together wood things, to knock them together as well as knock them apart. But how this is really intended to be used is on large truck tires, semi-truck tires. Their average tire pressure is around 100 psi or so. And because they're bias ply tires, they tend to be very, very rigid. On a car tire, it will kind of smoosh out some when it's sitting on the ground because it's a radial ply. On a bias ply tire, the sidewalls stay real rigid. So sometimes you don't really know if it has enough pressure in it. It would have to be pretty darn low for the sidewalls to start to flex. So how these work is you actually just bounce them off the side of the tire, and depending on the sound and how it reflects back, you can tell that it's too low on tire pressure. And it's quicker and easier to use something like this than it is to go check a whole bunch of, like on an 18-wheeler, you could be checking 18 wheels for tire pressure. So it's much easier just to go bead the side of the tire a couple times with this, and then when you run into a tire that's low, you instantly know. It kind of thuds more, it doesn't reflect back as much, it has a deeper reverberation sound, and lets you know you need to check on the tire. And they're kind of handy just for general use, and they have this large bolt that they put in the end of it just to help give it some weight. But if you ever see some kind of odd object like this, surprisingly enough, it is not a billy club. It is a tire checker. Real quickly here, some oddball hammers. This is like a little nutcracker hammer, but occasionally I found it handy just driving small roll pins. Same thing with this little plastic handled hammer. This is a very strange and kind of cheesy hammer. Surprisingly enough, it's nice to have small little hammers, particularly when you're working with small roll pins. I also work on various electronics. A lot of times there's glues and other things where you just need a small hammer just to knock something loose, just to persuade it a little bit. And so surprisingly enough, I found these kind of little hammers real handy. Same thing with these up here. This is kind of a strange hammer. I'm not exactly sure what it was intended for. Maybe furniture making or upholstery. There's a lot of hammers that are associated with furniture making and upholstery and textile industries that are pretty unique. And this most likely is one of those, and you can see it's a really odd asymmetrical hammer. This was a very odd little pocket knife hammer. This thing is actually cast stainless steel, and I thought that was quite amusing and kept it around. Just to show you, there are even stainless steel hammers. And then the last couple of oddballs up here. This is actually a 1-inch solid carbide end mill. This is actually a Niagara. And this I use as a straight hammer. There's often times where I just can't quite get the reach, and so I can use this to hit something straight on. It's surprisingly heavy, a good couple 3 pounds, because it is solid carbide. Because it's also solid carbide, it has a Rockwell well exceeding Rockwell 70, I should say, so it's very hard, harder than any hardness steel. And I haven't had any issues really with it chipping. Well, I am aware that carbide can chip, but what's really nice is it basically doesn't wear out because it's so hard. It's so dense, it really just delivers all the energy. And it's surprising, with just a little hand hammer such as this, has come quite in handy, quite useful. I think most recently there were a couple bolts that were hard to, that a nut, and they're hard to push through, and there just wasn't any place to really swing any kind of hammer, not even something small like this. But this thing was real nice because I was just able to get it in there and just tap it out, and just having all that mass in such a concentrated area, it works surprisingly well. So that's one of the strange and less common objects to use for a hammer, but is actually quite handy. And it would be nice to have a series of hand-type hammers made. This, I believe, is a furniture and upholstery hammer. What this looks like is a small-style spike maul. A spike maul would be the type of sledgehammer that's used to drive railroad spikes into sleepers or railroad ties. And they look like this. They have a round head, slightly angled, kind of like a drilling hammer, so that when you're swinging close to a surface, it lands it lands squarely. This one would be a furniture, and what's interesting is it has a bronze head, but it has steel tips inserted into that, and I thought that was interesting. And a small hammer like this would be so you could hammer small nails and staples, etc. When you're pulling cloth, you'd hammer a little nail into it. I'm not the most familiar with furniture making, but that's what somebody has told me this one is for. I don't use it for furniture making, but it's actually surprisingly handy to have a hammer. This has a larger and a smaller, I would say maybe a 5/16 and then maybe a 7/16 heads on it. And it's actually been real handy when you need to tap or hammer something and you need a real concentrated, real small tip to really deliver the energy or hit something that's just doesn't have much space available. And I've really ended up using this a lot more than I expected just because of that, just because it has a nice small head and you can really reach into a variety of areas. We do have our traditional ball peen hammers. And I remember I had done that brass hammer review and I said those machine ones are some of the best. These are some small little ball peen hammers, and they actually are built in a similar fashion. They are 3-piece with the independent. These are all steel, so a steel handle, steel neck, and a steel head, and they're just small, compact ball peen hammers. All ball peen hammers are. They're metalworking hammers, and they're designed to have one side to help flatten out metal, and then a round side to help, round it or shape it however you need to. That's kind of the deal with ball peen hammers. Here's one that's been quite used, and what ends up happening on the ball peen is it does end up getting flattened out, but you can file it and restore it some, and do that a few times before you start getting past the real hardened, heat-treated section, and it starts to wear faster. And they do, of course, have these in a variety of sizes. Here's a small wood handle one. This metal handle one's about the same mass as that wood handle one. And they're just kind of handy as small hammers, basically. And then, of course, here's a Vog hand, which would be considered more of a standard size ball peen hammer. A lot of people own and get these that aren't metal workers, and to tell you the truth, the ball side or the ball peen end really isn't particularly useful in a lot of industries where you're not working with sheet metal. Even though they're kind of interesting, and a lot of people know what a ball peen hammer is, very, very rarely does somebody actually have one because they needed a hammer that had a round nose on it because they were shaping something. And I wanted to bring that up because it seems a lot of people have ball peen hammers and get them. I have a lot of friends with them, and then I asked them, well, how often have you used the ball peen, to make a circular or hemispherical shape in something? And they inevitably say they don't or haven't. The last couple of hammers here we have are, of course, would be colloquially termed geologist hammers, perhaps rock hammers, perhaps hand picks, and this is exactly what they're intended for. They are pretty heavy hammers, usually in the This is 22 ounce. This one I believe is a 24 ounce. We have an S-Wing and a Vogue hand, which are a couple of nice brands. The S-Wing is better than the Vogue hand. You can see that the handle in the S-Wing is just a little bit better molded, a little bit better secured. The fit and finish is just a little bit nicer. You can see on the heads here where they're just a little bit more squared off in the S-Wing. When they beveled the square head, they did a little better job than the Vogue hand. So I did want to point that out, that generally S-Wings are better than Vogue hands. And there hasn't been a lot of times which I've been able to directly compare them. These things do tend to wear out pretty quickly because, of course, you're chipping through rock, and that's what the sharp spike is, and it tends to cause a lot of damage. The spike and eventually or inevitably gets pretty dull, and you have to just hit it to a grinder. And these, I've seen these, what happens is you actually grind them down, and they just get shorter and shorter, especially in very used ones. So it gets to a point where you just ground so much of it off that it's not very effective anymore. One nice thing versus a ball peen hammer, this hammer in anybody's tool collection would actually be far more useful than a ball peen. For a couple of reasons. One, it does have a sharp hook, so it can be used as a prying tool in various situations. It is a hand pick, so if you're in any situation where, say you're digging fence posts, something like that, it's great to have one of these where you may have used a pick in really hard ground, and you just need to shape the hole or do something, some smaller activities, maybe gardening. These things are absolutely great for breaking apart hard ground, hard clays, that kind of stuff. Have some dry rot and trying to see how deep it is. These are great for tripping out that dry rot, digging in there, and then seeing, how good or how bad the damage really is. And if you keep them sharp, they're great for stabbing into, logs, basic firewood, if they're real kind of wet or yucky or any of that kind of stuff, and stabbing it in and picking it up, using it as a tool to pick it up. One other thing I was going to point out is S-Wing seems to have compensated a little more for that inevitable wear and resharpening of the spike end, because we can see that they offset the handle closer to the front square face, giving you actually a longer pick end. So of course it would take a little bit more resharpening and use before it gets down so far to be unusable. Anyway, that was the end of this quick video of just kind of specialty and unique hammers. I'll finish up with one more video, but it'll be all about claw hammers, because I have a lot of those. The claw hammer is the world's most popular hand tool. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching. Please subscribe. Catus Maximus out.